The dose at 10 hours, say, climbed very slowly because the short-lived fission products had decayed. They were gone by the time they got to Utah. And the dose, as a result, is much lower. If you look at the scales, factors of 10 or 100 times lower. So what happened at Utah? Why were they compensated? Well, there are other radionuclides, and iodine is not a prominent one at short times, but it becomes one of the most important ones later. And the reason it becomes important, if I'm standing out here and somebody sets a nuke off 50 miles away, or a reactor releases iodine, or a hospital using iodine to treat patients for thyroid disease releases iodine, any of those. And I stand there and the plume wafts over me and I inhale it. I'll get a dose of about 1 rem per microcurie. That's just a number, don't worry about that. But if that same iodine will react and cover the grass. Iodine is an extremely reactive chemical. Anything it touches organic, it binds to. It forms a iodine compound with anything organic. Grass, it loves grass. And then cows can eat the grass, and cows incorporate it into the milk. And the milk then gets shipped to a dairy and gets moved to a grocery store, and that takes about 3 days. So the cow eats, 3 days later the milk's on the shelf for the grocery store, right? Iodine has an 8-day half-life, so it doesn't really disappear, it's still there. The cow-grass milk pathway, as we call it, concentrates the iodine so much, the dose now is 600 times higher than what I would have had if I just standed up in the field breathing it in, because the environmental pathway concentrates it. That's why the iodine pathway was so focused on by National Cancer Institutes for the Utah downwinders. That's why the focus of their whole study was iodine, iodine, iodine. That's the problem. Well, it was the problem for them because at 10 hours, all the short-lived stuff's gone. And for the immediate downwinders, they faced extraordinarily high radiation levels at Trinity. What's this one? Let me talk about cows, or not cows, I'm not a rancher. Cattle, right? Okay, gotta get my terms right here. But there were cattle on the Chupadera Mesa, and they had fallout fall on their hides. And the fallout stayed on their hides, and they got very high radiation exposure, so high that the skin burned off their back. And so the Army went to the farmers and said, look, we'll buy these cows from you, and paid for the cows. They bought about 75 cows. A few of them, I think 15 or so, stayed at Los Alamos, and 60 of them were shipped to Oak Ridge, and one was still living, I think, in the 70s, the last one of that. And they were used for various experiments. If a cow eats something, where does the radioactive material go in a cow, and how does it compare to a human? Those sorts of tests. So they lived a long, well-fed life and weren't sent to be eaten by anybody. But the ones that sent to Los Alamos with the skin burned off, they said that the radiation doses would be equivalent to upwards of 50,000 rads. But that's beta exposure. In the fallout field, there's gamma radiation. That's a very penetrating radiation, like the X-ray machines in doctor's office or the radiation therapy machines. If you have a friend who's undergone cancer therapy, that punches through a lot of material. Beta radiation is an electron that comes from the decay of the atom. The beta radiation is not very penetrating, but it will penetrate skin. And so with beta radiation, when we worry about it, we worry about what's the skin exposure and what's the lens of the eye exposure. And in those cases, this is a very famous curve by a guy, Jack Healy at Los Alamos. And he said, well, what happens to human skin? If I get in a nuclear plant and I open a valve and whoosh, water splashes all over my hand, what happens to me? What's the dose? And what he did was did a series of calculations. And if you look at this X equals 7, the human skin is about 7 milligrams per square centimeter thick. That's what if you autopsy people, cut skin off, and that's the areal density. It's the thickness in centimeters divided by the number of grams of that. And so 7 milligrams per square centimeter is the thickness of your skin. And he said, well, if it's thicker skin going up to cattle, the skin will shield more. So the cells that divide and grow new skin won't be irradiated. And he also looked at H. If you have extra thicknesses of paper or hide or hair, that will also cut the dose down. When I looked at this set of curves back in the 80s, I said, all I got to remember is 7. At the time we had the hot particle problem at nuclear power plants, they would bring me in to a meeting with a worker. The worker would have contamination on his skin, and they'd say, well, what are we going to do? And I say, well, I have to run the NRC-approved computer code VARSCAN, and I've got to have data. And they said, well, what do we get? And I'd say, okay, between you and me and the tree over there, if I take your counts in the Geiger tube times the efficiency of the Geiger tube for microcuries per square centimeter, I get, and multiply it by 7, you probably got 300 millirem or whatever the number happened to be. The worker said, is that bad? And I'd say, I don't think so, but wait until I do the calculation, we'll get the official number. So this allowed me to go into meetings and very quickly tell what the number was without having to run computer programs. But the interesting thing is, what if we look at that and ask what happens in the fallout at Trinity? And you have to combine the two graphs, the areal density graph and the dose you get per beta, per microcurie per square centimeter of beta contamination, how many rads an hour you get. If you combine those two, if one looks at the H+1 dose estimates and uses Healy's graph of 7 rads per hour per microcurie per square centimeter, what was that inner curve? What was that, 10 rads or 50 rads? I think it was 10. Yeah. So the innermost curve, it says here, is 10 rads an hour. Divide that by 7, and you get 7. Let me go back to Jack Healy's curve. Divide that by your 7, and you get 1.4 microcuries per square centimeter. In a square meter, you have almost 14 millicuries of radioactivity, right? That's something over 10. This is more than 10,000 times typical fallout levels that were encountered on data we collected. In the 40s, the Public Health Service never collected fallout data. There wasn't fallout. But when atmospheric testing occurred and the superpowers both engaged in testing, you were getting fallout, and the Public Health Service started, I think, in '58 with 45 stations. They put a number of tests out. They put vacuum cleaners out with filters, counted the filter. They'd take a square foot of flypaper, sticky flypaper, and lay it out on a wood platform that would collect the fallout and all sorts of dust as well. And then they'd count the radioactivity on the plate. So they started a program of monitoring that allowed them to monitor Nevada test site fallout as well as fallout from the Soviets and other nuclear powers. This Trinity fallout was never encountered by the Public Health Service. It was an incredible number. The cattle at Los Alamos provide a crude measurement of their concentration they were exposed to. The cattle had arguably 20,000 in the Chapter 10 report, 20,000 rad exposure. Or if it's 7 rads per hour, you get an integrated exposure of microcurie hours of exposure. How many hours you kept the microcuries on the cattle resulted in that exposure of 20,000 hour. So this type number, they never had cattle with the skin burned off their back in Utah because they were 100 miles away. The short-lived stuff all decayed away. So now, what does that mean for someone? This is a house, the Nalda Ranch. It's in our report. We got a picture of it. That roof is probably 100 square meters, right? So on their roof, if they're in that area, the 10 hour per hour area, they had 1,400 millicuries of radioactivity, 1.4 curies. I know some don't know what that number means. If you're here at the school and you go to a nuclear lab, they have little plastic discs that are called exempt sources. The NRC doesn't require them to be licensed. They're about 1/1,000,000th of a curie, 1 microcurie. When you go to a lab and you count it on a counter, you learn how to count it. This had 1.4 millionth of those little sources taped to the roof in a fine dust. When it rained later that afternoon, the ductwork from the gutter system conveyed the water to the cistern collected the radioactive material. So in our report, we said, and in our comments to NCI later, when they issued their protocol, what they were going to do, we said, well, you really need to worry about cisterns, because this is even perhaps a more powerful pathway for exposure than that cow grass milk pathway that is very powerful and impacted Utah. But this is unique. It wouldn't have happened in Utah, but it did happen downwind of Trinity. Now, let me jump here and talk about RECA provisions, because I've heard so much, and I just wanted to make sure everybody understands. 1990, Mo Udall coordinated getting the law passed, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. Stewart. Thank you. Stand corrected. But in that law, a number of provisions were placed, but what they said was, because people who lived in a number of counties in southern Utah were experiencing some cancers, about 20 cancers, there's 18 cancers, primary cancers of these various organs, right? I don't see melanoma. And leukemia is a very different cancer, and multiple myeloma. But 18 cancers plus leukemia, there's about 100 different types of cancers, but many cancer types are not sensitive to radiation. Radiation doesn't increase them. We know that from the Japanese survivors. And all cancers except the leukemias had to have an onset of 5 years. They found in the 20s that medical doctors who had rapidly begun using x-rays for medical treatments and for taking x-ray pictures, is a wonderful technology, rapidly absorbed. But the medical doctors going to conferences were finding they had leukemia at high rates. And leukemia is a very rare cancer. And so they started we had to have rules, how much is good. The very first rule was, don't get more than a sunburn per day. Because if you hold your hand under a dental x-ray machine and push the button a bunch of times, you can get to the point where you get a little bit of a sunburn. Don't do that. Don't tell anybody I told you to do that, but it's a matter of fact. So that was called an erythema dose. And later they revised that number down, but to solve it, they created an organization called the International Conference on Radiation Protection, the ICRP. That's the granddaddy organization that researches what is known about radiation effects and provides guidance. But from that, we know, like in the Japanese survivors, for example, we saw leukemia spike 3 to 7 years after the bomb. So in actual fact, when you saw that, you said, that makes sense. That's what you've seen before. So we know leukemia occurs very rapidly. Bone marrow is a very sensitive organ to radiation. And the others take longer to develop. In fact, some of these cancers take many years. Melanoma, which is one I'd ask about. If cattle got 20,000 rads, what would a rancher who is working outside? Now, clearly if it's flour like dust coming down, he'd be wiping it off. The cattle don't really do that. So it'll be lower, but it's still going to be a very large number. What about melanoma in the population and cataract formation from lens of the eye dose? Those may impact Trinity downwinders. Now, the whole purpose of the program, if you're judged eligible, if you have one of these cancers, if you live 2 years in those years, you get $50,000 and no medical care. Eligible people who are called participants get $75,000 under the Act. So if you worked on the Trinity test for Los Alamos and after the war you wanted to go home and live your normal life, you maybe were drafted into the special engineering detachment, the chemists who did a lot of work there, you just wanted to go home. You quit after the war, went home. And you didn't become atomic energy workers or energy department workers, but you took part in the Trinity test. So those individuals who get $75,000, for example, the Searchlight team members, remember I pointed out the Searchlight on the graph. They who may have left Los Alamos would become eligible for the RECA compensation, and if they didn't, if they stayed at Los Alamos and worked their career there, came down with cancer, then they'd become eligible for energy employee compensation. So certainly those participants, those individuals present at the time of Trinity are covered by Compensation Acts. This is the NCI study, and it shows the iodine-131 exposure from all testing of nuclear bombs it's actually a wrong statement, isn't it? Because they didn't have any measurements in the 40s. They should have said, from all atmospheric nuclear bomb tests, except for the Trinity test in New Mexico. That would be right. But that study does not include Trinity, right? So if you look at New Mexico, it doesn't have this bright red slash in the middle going up to the northeast. That's reflective of Trinity. So this data is somewhat misleading. It also shows you the maximum type doses were in the 12 to 16 rad range. I gotta go through, there's so much jargon. If I drink contaminated milk with iodine and it affects me, almost all the iodine goes to your thyroid. It's a butterfly-shaped gland right in your throat, regulates hormones, right? And if you drank iodine at excessive levels, you might get thyroid cancer. How do you relate those rads to an exposure of your entire body where every organ is irradiated? And in my field, we have what we call organ weighting factors. And so with the thyroid gland, you take this number and you multiply it by 0.04 to make a dose that would be equivalent to what the victims in Hiroshima and Nagasaki got, a whole body dose of their entire body, every organ in their body irradiated. So these numbers here aren't the same as the 50 R per hour shown in that earlier curve. These are exaggerated because they're showing the energy deposited in a very small organ, right? So that's an important point to make. This is the map of the downwinder counties that currently permitted in the act. Not right again. That's just shows you the red line encompasses the area that Congress decided to do. There's a guy, a fellow I know, Bruce Church. He was the director of Nevada Operations Office. We did some work together. He cleaned up the Bikini Atoll, spent $1 billion of our taxpayer dollars cleaning it up. 2 years ago, he and a colleague gave a paper about the Nevada downwinders. And radiation is funny in some ways. If I had 100 people, average in the US, if you follow them their whole lives, based on our data from the government, about 41 of them get cancer and about 25 die from cancer, right? That's the typical averages. Take those 100 people and give them 100 rads. It's a very big number. They won't kill them. But those same people will now have 5 extra cancers. So instead, if you have the 100 people who are irradiated, 46 will get cancer, 5 extra or 30 will die of cancer. That's the statistics. Now, if we reduce it, person rads. If I take that 10,000 person rads and put it in 1 million people, just a little bit of dose to everybody, we still expect to see those 5 extra cancers. So when Bruce Churches gave his paper, he said, Congress had to very carefully design the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. The large population centers in Utah in the northern part of the state, there are many, many people there. They also got dose, if you go back to that earlier slide, they also got dose, but much lower than the people who are in the immediate counties downwind. But it would have cost too much to pay for everybody who got cancer, one of those 18 identified cancers in those high population counties that had lower exposures. And at some stage, where do you end the compensation? And Congress always needs to look at dollars. Now, there's also been a lot of statements. I'm covering a lot of ground here, and I apologize if I'm open to questions as long as you want at the end. People often talk of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and there was a tremendous thing. There were about 500,000 people in the 2 cities, combined cities, before they dropped the bomb. 2 bombs. After the bombs dropped, about 3 months later, there was about 250,000 people left. It killed half the people in the 2 cities. It was a horrific thing. People died, horrible accident. They think about 80% of those deaths may have been due to fires and blast injuries, and maybe 20% due to the radiation. But if you got more than 3/4 mile away from where the bomb went off, you began to survive. So we binned the Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors into rads. I apologize, this is a millisievert chart. After World War II, the US went over and started looking at the Japanese population, asking them, where were you in the city and what injuries? And the Japanese were very squirrelish about it. We funded the RERF, the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, and they still were squirrely about it because they felt they were being used as guinea pigs. But the scientists wanted to know, what's the effect of radiation? And this population is our preeminent set. They're our gold standard. They're where those 18 cancers in the RECA Act, those come from this study. And so we were able to convince about 86,000 out of the 250,000 to participate in a lifespan study. And those people, the 86,000, you have to divide this number, let's see, 100 millisieverts would be 10 rads, which would be similar to that graph I showed. So these people here received, the 37,000 people were so far out of the city, they received very little radiation from the bomb, right? These people received twice as much, right? And in these two groups, when you plot the data out, you don't really see an extra cancers in them. We know they're there, but there's so many people, and if you recall, 41% of them are going to get cancer. So out of the 86,000 members of the lifespan study, close to, 70,000 of them were lightly exposed. And we can't really see a positive effect because 70,000 people times 41% is what, 38,000 or something, people get the cancer. So you aren't able to measure cancer in those groups. Once you get above this point, there's a positive separation. You can clearly see cancer generation in the populations in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they've been into these 7 categories. And this shows, as of 2018 or so, out of the 86,000 subjects, the total number of cancer deaths, we've had 9,000. The low exposure units, we had 6,000 or 7,000 that we're not sure if those were natural or not. There's just so much cancer in the human population. Once you start getting up here, you begin to see separations, but there's very few people in it. Now, where would you put Trinity, right? And often people say, well, they didn't get exposed anywhere near what the Japanese survivors. And I agree. Of the 20% of 250,000, 100,000 people who were killed by radiation in the direct bombs, nobody was killed in New Mexico. Okay, nobody was killed in Utah either. But if you look at it, that's this greater than 2,000 category. Above that level, when you get to 3,000, 4,000, without strong medical care, people don't survive. There's a miracle treatment, total body radiation for treatment of leukemia if you go to Indianapolis. And they extract your bone marrow, giving you growth hormones to boost your marrow production if you have leukemia, separate it out. They give you 10,000 millisieverts. You'd be dead. But they put pieces of lead over your lungs so they don't burn your lungs out. They do all kinds of things. Put you in a laminar flow room, treat you like a man in the bag. They treat you with plastic gloves so they don't bring any contamination. And they treat your symptoms and manage to help you survive with extraordinary medical care. But when you're down in this range here, you don't die. Even in the privation that the Japanese suffered after the bombing of their cities. So cancer deaths in this group here. So what's some points, what's some observations I make out of it? When I look at the Trinity external dose of 140 rads, and that would be 1,400 millisieverts. Trinity had members in these groups, all the way up to this group, but they didn't have anybody collapsing and dying and vomiting at Trinity. That's this group at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was a severely exposed group with very limited survivors. If you look at the Utah iodine dose multiplied by that organ weighting factor, they only had exposures in the first category. So the comparisons between Utah and Trinity need to factor in. Trinity had some very different exposure pathways. When scientists have looked at it, oftentimes, because of the extensive studies done on Utah, we had 167 people we pulled off bikini for the tests. And we gave millions of dollars to the Marshallese, and their government spent it wisely, but they have a trust fund that pays each of these 100. There's still probably 60 people left from bikini who were residents at the time we initiated testing in the 50s out in the Pacific. And they get $15,000 a year from the trust fund. It's kind of a funny environment. I don't know if they have a Chevrolet dealer in White Store or Bingham, but if you're out on bikini, there ain't no Toyota dealer. But they need Toyotas. So they go in with their $15,000, they buy Toyota 4Runner vehicles because they're fishermen, they need work vehicles. They drive them until they don't work anymore, and then they buy another one. So it's a strange environment, but it's the way life works. I go out, you just shake your head sometimes at things that happen that are strange. But that's what the Marshall Islands have gotten, and they've asked for, and Congress said they should get more, but they haven't authorized the funds for it. So that's a big fight in Congress. RICA, there's been about 34,000 people and about $2 billion expended, and they get 50,000 each. There have been a number of what they call the participants in the test who get 75,000. I didn't break those two out separately. Trinity, pardon?
What's RICA?
RICA is the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. And that's the act that funds the downwinders from Utah. Okay? I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear. So that lets you know the magnitude of the programs and sort of the differences between Trinity and the other tests. Now, I said I'd talk about someone. Last year, I was fortunate. I met several people when we were having our closeout public meetings. I'd had a really bad accident, burst 2 discs, but there was no way I was going to miss the meeting, so I came, and the people looked at me and said, hey, don't stand up and don't talk. And I don't know if they were mostly saying, don't stand up because they didn't want me to be in pain with my sciatic nerve burning down my leg, or whether they just didn't want me to talk. And you can decide, we won't have a vote after this one, but you can decide that separately. So they had me sit down, and I have to say, you know, I recall an elderly gentleman came up and he described his circumstances during the Trinity and immediately after, and it was very moving, you know. And I was just sitting there and said, you know, I came to the end. He talked for a while, and I said, you know, I don't know what to tell you. You know, I'm a consultant. I work for the government. You know, I can't fix this. I don't know what to say. And he just looked at me and said, son, he said, you're the first person from the government who ever listened to me. Yeah. And it was I was just floored by that simple reaction. And similarly, Barbara Kent was 14 at the time at Trinity. Her story's been told before. At 14, her parents sent her to a dance camp with her dance instructor near Risotto with 12 other girls, or she was one of the 12. And they felt the blast. There were enough downwind. They were in that red area. When fallout came, the girls ran outside and began to use it as pancake makeup. It was a light flower, light dusting, and they were just playing. They're teenagers, I guess. And Barbara said that what she had done was wipe this fallout over her face. And at age 14, her hair turned white in a band all around her face. And I told you that I flunked that Myers-Briggs personality test. So Barbara told me this, and I immediately said, I didn't say, oh, that's awful, or I'm so sorry. I said, did you have any moist desquamation? And she said, what? And I said, blistering.